Idealism prevails.
Make the world a better place.
Hello and welcome here at VIPAC to our weekly analysis of the war in Ukraine. Today again with political scientist Professor Mangott from the University of Innsbruck. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see you again.
And with my colleague Sascha Stipsits from the Czech Republic. Good morning.
Dobré ráno.
Today I'd like to begin with the history of Ukraine, as I think this is quite important to understand the fierce resistance that the Ukraine is now bringing against the Russian invasion. From the Russian side, we heard that Ukraine has no tradition, no national tradition, as it's only independent since 1991, which is not particularly true. And on the other side, the Ukrainians had several traumatizing experiences with foreign powers, like, for example, the Soviet Union during the Holodomor in the 1930s, where millions died due to starvation, but also with Nazi Germany and with the Ottoman Empire in earlier years. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that in the beginning.
Well, in the current borders, indeed, Ukraine has been existing only since 1991. Over the centuries, of course, the territory of today's Ukraine has been contested between various great powers, the Poles and Lithuanians, the Austrians, the Austrian-Hungarians, and of course, Russia. And various parts of the country have been under the control of these different powers, which of course had an impact on language, religion, ethnic kinship, and of course also the identity of the respective regions of Russia. Strong control over parts of today's Russia has been prepared already in the 18th century, and particularly Catherine the Great was very successful in bringing under control quite a lot of the territory of today's Ukraine. After the Brest-Litovsk peace agreement that the Russian Federation signed with Nazi Germany, there was a period of short interim statehood of Ukraine, or of that territory at least, but this was only for a short while. When the Soviet Union was established, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was created, and in his speech at the beginning of the current war of Russia against Ukraine, Putin referred to the actions taken by the Soviet leaders, particularly Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Joseph Stalin, and he accused them of having created something like Ukraine and having handed over to this Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic territories which had belonged to what they call traditional historic Russia, meaning the Russian Empire. And of course, Ukrainians suffered, like also Russians and Kazakh people suffered, by the collectivization of agriculture during the Stalin period, which led to famines, huge catastrophic famines, which killed millions of citizens, including, of course, millions of Ukrainian people, which they now refer to as the Holodomor, a genocide committed by the Soviet Union against the Ukrainian people. After 1945, with new territories added to Ukraine, there was a resistance movement opposing the control of the region by the Soviet regime, and it took the Soviet Union more than a decade to bring down this insurgency, this armed insurgency against Soviet control. In 1991, Ukraine was one of the most important forces to bring the Soviet Union to its dismemberment. The president of Ukraine at the time, Leonid Kravchuk, signed with the Russian president Boris Yeltsin and the Belarusian head of parliament, Mr. Shushkevich, on March 8th, 1991, to declare the dissolution of the USSR. So Ukraine, of course, was, like Russia and Belarus, crucial for what was eventually the downfall of the Soviet Union.
Thank you. This was very comprehensive and clear. description. So now let us make the jump into the present time. As of today, apparently a Russian warship was just blown up. And what I want to say by that is the rumors are the Russian army is kind of stuck, rather demoralized, has some problems with supplies, and is indeed very surprised and demoralized by the very strong resistance, and not only around Kiev. Is that propaganda and wishful thinking, or are those who say the Russian army as it stands now in the Ukraine will be quagmired and most possibly not win the war this way, and are looking for a new kind of army, that there is in the background discussions about what is the next step for Russia? How do you see that? Are they as much in trouble as some think?
Well, first of all, we need to state we are in an information war. So, of course, messages, reports we receive are part of the manipulated communication. But still, there is evidence that Russian troops are in a stalemate on various fronts, particularly around Kiev, Sumy, or Kharkiv. On the other hand, the Russians are on the offensive quite successfully in the east of Ukraine and in the southern regions of Ukraine. They are about to take Mariupol with all the brutalities that they have used against civilians in this siege of Mariupol. And then the Russians will have quite a broad land bridge between Crimea and the separatist republics in the Donbass. And we might also expect that Russia will start to bring war also to the region of Odessa, the city of Odessa, with the aim, as I see, to take away every access to the Black Sea for Ukraine. And that might be a more successful operation. As of such, the operations from the south have been the most successful in this current war. But indeed, yes, Russia has encountered difficulties, poor planning, underestimation of the will and resolve of the Ukrainian armed forces to resist, to fight back, to defend. Maybe also troubled by the huge inflow of weaponry from the West to Ukraine, which strengthens, of course, the resilience of the Ukraine armed forces. And we have rumors that Defense Minister Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff, Mr. Nikita Gerasimov, are under pressure in Russia for what is considered a very poor performance, as it is part of the domestic intelligence service of Russia, the FSB. We had some arrests among the leading ranks of the FSB for allegedly poor information about what will happen in Ukraine if Russians start to invade. So yes, there seems to be a great deal of anger and discontent with Vladimir Putin, and he's starting to cleanse the ranks of some of his military and security institutions.
Chris, never mucho? Okay,
yep,
thank you. But of course, this is not a good sign for the war, because we hardly can expect Mr. Putin to relent. That is, I think, something that is not in the books. And on the other side, as we may now call it, indeed, the other side, on the NATO side, we are hearing that in Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovakia, we will be increasing troop sizes, let alone the constant inflow of small and larger armor towards the Ukraine through Germany and Poland from the NATO. Now, are we already, however this happens, let me just throw this out here. When I look at this, I would say that at the very least, a new Iron Curtain is for certain. Because once these troops are here, they're not going to go home the day after any peace talks start. There's no peace talks on the horizons that are working. Do we have a second Cold War actually already?
Well, indeed, relations between the West and Russia are frozen, deeply frozen. we cannot think about the normalization of the relations between the West and Russia until or as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. I cannot think of Putin entering European territory anymore. He's simply a pariah, so he won't be accepted and respected. So relations will be deeply frozen for quite a long time. And what makes matters worse, we see efforts in economic decoupling between the West, particularly the European Union, and the Russian Federation, which might go so far as an imposition of a full trade embargo of the West on the Russian Federation. We see a militarization of the relations. We see an increase in troops, particularly from NATO's side, in the eastern members of the North Atlantic Alliance, with a huge buildup of substantial combat forces, which will reside there on a permanent basis, which actually means that the founding document for the relations between NATO and Russia, the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, is dead. He is dead without any of the two parties announcing that it is dead. With NATO now deploying substantial combat forces on a permanent basis in Eastern Europe, they signal that they no longer feel actually bound to this agreement. And of course, Russia, even before, with this war of aggression and some other steps, has undermined this founding document. So that will also mean that the only consultative forum we have had between NATO and Russia since 2002, the NATO-Russia Council, is actually being abandoned. And so there's no institutionalized forum for contacts between NATO and Russia. Not that the NATO-Russia Council has actually worked very well over the past 2 to 3 years, but at least we had this forum for contacts. Now that is gone. So yes, we see this huge militarization and an arms race on both sides, with institutions collapsing, like the NATO-Russia Council, and leading documents on the relations between the West and Russia now being torn apart. So we are in a very strong political, ideological, economic, and military confrontation. It's not wrong to call it a Cold War, despite the fact that the current Cold War has some differences with the classical Cold War that we have seen in the 20th century. Some elements are missing. At that time, we had a bipolar world. Now we have a multipolar world. At that time, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States actually shaped global politics. So the Cold War now between the West and Russia will not, or not to the extent we have had it during the classical Cold War. But despite noting on an academic level the differences we have between the two periods of confrontation, we can, for our daily conversations, definitely speak about the Cold War, very unfortunately so.
As we often hear that it's important, even in war, to keep some channels open to the other side, do you think that the OSCE is still be trusted from both sides, also from Russia, from maybe providing a platform?
I don't see the OSCE to play any substantial role. The Polish presidency of the OSCE had tried at the very start to start a dialogue on stabilization and a dialogue on mutual security. The Russians have not been interested very much in it, particularly because of the fact that the initiative was a Polish initiative, and relations between Poland and Russia are even more frozen than relations between the West and Russia in general. So I don't think that the OSCE will play a role. It's also a very unwieldy body with more than 50 member countries. So no, I don't think this one will be a venue for mediation or even negotiations. NATO will not, as NATO-Russia Council is dead. And well, actually, these are two parties to this current armed conflict. And so well, there's no role for the NATO-Russia Council as a forum for mediation. The Security Council of the United Nations doesn't work because of Russia vetoing every decision that the Security Council is trying to take on the issue. So no, I don't see actually an international organization which would be capable of and trusted enough to become a venue for negotiations and a settlement of this current crisis.
Yes, sadly, I agree. The UN is practically dead. So let me ask you this. Let's look at the human side of this a little bit more closely. The little institute that we are running in Slavonice has now been informed that our town is being allocated a certain number of refugees, which will be arriving in the next few days. So that means the war is coming home to everyone. And Austria will be receiving refugees, of course. Poland, by now, apparently, we have to expect around 10 million in the near future, and that may not be the end of it. So my question to you is this maybe, and all this seemingly indiscriminate bombing of habited areas, may refugees be used as a weapon here a little bit as well? Because I cannot see, or how do you see that Europe will be dealing with this? On the face of it, if we were talking, sorry, to remind us of the Syrian crisis, but compared to the numbers, the Syrian crisis was an unfortunate joke. This is plus the Syrian crisis that is continuing, a real strain on our resources, the way I'm calculating it in my head, not only for us on the ground now, really. Can we do that? Can Europe do that?
Well, what I said in recent interviews with you, namely that Russia will brutalize this war, this actually has happened with indiscriminate shelling of residential areas, attacking civilian targets, which actually is a war crime. And they do that for two reasons. First of all, they want to break the morale of the population of the cities attacked. And secondly, they want to force the citizens of these regions of Ukraine to flee. And they have led in a greater number until now to the western part of Ukraine, to a smaller but already very high number to countries of the European Union and to Moldova. And well, if the war expands to the western part of Ukraine, then we will see that the internally displaced persons which have moved to the western regions of Ukraine will try to flee Ukrainian territory, and they will definitely arrive in the European Union. So this will be an enormous burden for EU countries, as it is already now for Poland, for instance. This will need a lot of resources, financial, material resources. What I see as a difference is that so far we have not seen any strong opposition of political forces in the European Union against Ukrainian refugees because of the closer the culturally closer nature of the Ukrainian population and the fact that it is very well educated and would be a very important addition to the workforce in the European Union. So far, these refugees are more welcome than the refugees from Syria and other parts of the globe, which, of course, as Arab Muslims or other ethnic groups had been considered and are considered as alien to the European culture, and were very much rejected by not so small portions of European societies. So this is a difference. And also in the Syrian case, we had a lot of young men leaving Syria and Afghanistan, Bangladesh and the like. But so far, what we have seen from Ukraine is almost only women and children, which also makes a difference, I guess, in the emotional reception of this refugee stream on behalf of EU populations.
That's very interesting. May I take it on for a second? So you're actually saying, and I find that interesting and agree, Demographically, Western Europe is in decline. I mean, countries like Italy have under one child. This is insane, unimaginable, even 40 years ago. So, and the educational part I found interesting. So you see also there could be a positive aspect because most of the refugees hopefully will be able to go home eventually in a few years' time. I cannot imagine it being next month. But you would say that the Ukrainians, as already in the Czech Republic, as in several countries, they are already part of the workforce. We could integrate the Ukrainians rather well.
Well, if the war ends with the defeat of the Ukrainian government and large parts of Ukraine will remain under Russian control and occupation army, then of course the refugees that have already left Ukraine and those who will be leaving Ukraine under these circumstances will stay in the European Union for quite some time, for a long period of time. And if they do so, they will, of course, strengthen the workforce of the European Union. They will improve demographic statistics of EU countries. So actually, they are a boon to the European economy. If the war stops soon, if there's a mediated solution, if Russian troops withdraw, which I consider very unlikely, then we may see, of course, that a lot of the refugees will return to Ukraine. Well, not immediately, but in the foreseeable future. They all have the desire to rebuild their country if they get the chance to do so. And they will rebuild the country with the financial and material support of the West, definitely. And then, of course, this workforce will leave Europe again, maybe not fully, of course, but to a large extent. So it depends very much on the course and the future course of the war, whether we will see a rather permanent Ukrainian refugee basis in the European Union, or if they are only here for a limited time and will return to Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine, which of course is also a difference to the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015, when the Syrian refugees, of course, for very understandable reasons, had no desire to return back to Syria.
For our viewers, next week, Monday, we will have an extensive interview about the refugee topic with the refugee expert Gerald Knaus. So we'll go into detail then. Let's go to the economic part. Vladimir Putin just announced yesterday that he will charge gas in the future in ruble and not in dollar or euro anymore. Do you think that also oil will follow to be charged in ruble, or will it stay with dollar, or what is the impact, the long-term impact of this decision, or will it have a long-term impact?
Sorry, just to throw this in, you may have mentioned it, but the ÖMV, the Austrian petroleum state company, has already declined to do so. So that will be interesting. So ÖMV has said no. So let's see. It's only a small player, but yeah.
Well, the interest behind this decision was that for paying Russian gas bills in ruble, the Western countries would need to buy Russian ruble to a very considerable volume, and this would prop up the external value of the Russian currency. And actually, we have already seen a limited strengthening of the value of the Russian ruble yesterday after this announcement by Vladimir Putin. Well, actually, this would mean that if Western companies importing gas from the Russian Federation, if they pay in Russian ruble, this will actually circumvent some of the sanctions the West has imposed on the Russian Federation, particularly with its sanctions on the Russian Central Bank. So actually, this is a step to undermine the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian Federation. So from a political point of view, of course, it's highly undesirable to accept the new procedure of paying the gas bills to Russia's Gazprom. So politics will do whatever it can to prevent Western companies from paying the bills in Russian ruble. And in addition to that, of course, in the contracts that Gazprom has signed with European consumers, it is noted that the bills have to be paid and will be paid in euros or dollars. So if Putin now announces only Russian rubles will be accepted, then this is a violation of a very important term of the contract between Gazprom and Western companies. So we have to wait and see what will happen. Well, if Western companies, most of them or all of them, will reject the Russian demand, then we have to wait and see if the Russians will cut gas supplies to European customers in full, which would, of course, be a tremendous burden for Western economies and societies, despite all the talk that we will be able in quite a short period of time to reduce our dependence on Russian gas deliveries. This is all talk, but not very manageable in the immediate future. This is a long-term initiative, which is sound, but there's nothing we can do in the short term to deal with a complete cutoff of Russian gas supplies to the European Union, particularly countries like Austria and Germany, of course, would be heavily affected, with Germany taking in Russian gas to the amount of 55% of its gas consumption, and in Austria it's even 80%. So we cannot substitute these volumes in a short period of time, which will of course, create a lack of gas, and not everyone will be supplied with gas in European countries, but private households will be preferred, and industries, energy-intensive industries which work on with gas, actually have to close down.
Question from you?
Well, I'm glad it's springtime, so that's all I can say. That buys us a little bit of time. Okay. I have two questions that I really want to ask, and they are kind of unrelated within themselves. But I throw one out now because it just struck me last night in my research, and then you can see. And then I have one for the end of the conversation, which I really would like Professor Mangott's opinion on. So the first question is the use of the internet. I mean, we are using it, obviously. It has changed our world tremendously. This will be debated. It's a historic time we live in, no question about that. The pandemic has done its. It's like a training course for us for these times now. But what I found interesting is that German media said this morning that there are YouTube tutorials for the use of rockets and small arms and all arms on the internet that are teaching the Ukrainians how to, the private citizens, how to use the weapons that are being sent from the West. Now, this is quite incredible to me, because it does change war as well in a fashion. Then there's also the situation with Starlink and Elon Musk, who is really actively supporting the Ukrainians while kind of also helping them to jam the Russians. The Russians are having communication problems on the ground within the Ukraine. They sometimes have to use mobile phones. How do you see the impact of the internet or new communication technologies on war, and specifically this situation at the moment? Is that really a substantial enough game changer to mention it, or is this just a silly byline in the news?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a game changer, but it is very important and relevant, of course, for the course of the war. Ukraine sees the tremendous support by Western companies and countries to keep up communications, to keep up the internet. You mentioned Elon Musk, and to have all the information sent via the social media and alternative media to the Ukrainian side. If they actually teach Ukrainian civilians how to wage war with the weapons delivered by the West, then we also need to stress, but it's just a side remark, we need to stress that if civilians take up arms, they are no longer considered to be civilians, but as combatants, and so they are legitimate targets for the Russian forces. This is something we need to keep in mind, and this is something we should be concerned about. Well, in Russia, the internet has been the source of information for those more educated, more well-off urban citizens who have now also raised their voices against the war and Russia. And that is maybe more relevant than what happens with the internet in Ukraine. Russia is now trying to block social media for this part of the population by banning Facebook, by banning Instagram, by closing down Google News, which was announced yesterday evening. So what they are trying to do is to keep alternative information out of the circulation within Russia. This does, of course, make it also more difficult for opponents of this war to organize themselves, to organize events and demonstrations, as they increasingly lack the channels and tools of communication about such efforts. On the position of the wider public of Russia, the majority of Russia's population, I don't think this has a very strong impact, because many still get their news from state television. What they hear and see on state television is, of course, pure war propaganda.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question before you wrap it up with your last question. Joe Biden, the US president, is today in Brussels meeting with the European Union. What do you expect from this meeting? Any new sanctions, maybe?
Well, Biden has announced that new sanctions will be imposed. The question is what kind of sanctions. Biden has also, before he came to Europe, stated publicly that he understands that the European partners are not united on the issue of imposing an energy embargo on Russia, because some countries in the European Union would be particularly affected by such an embargo. So there's no chance that we will see a gas embargo announced today. Maybe what we will see is sanctions on Russian oil trade. That is likely. But coming back to the general question, Biden needs, and that's one of the reasons for his trip to Europe, Biden needs new sanctions, because at home, Biden has already been criticized by Democrats and particularly by Republicans not to be strong enough and not to be harsh enough on Russia. And if he returns from Europe without new sanctions, without agreement with the European allies on new sanctions, of course, this will undermine his position further. His visit, of course, is also seen as a demonstration of unity, strength, resolve. And it's also a reassurance for the Eastern European NATO members, that's for sure. But on the very hot topics in the debate within NATO, namely introducing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, sending, as the Poles have proposed, a NATO peace mission to Ukraine, or even send Polish aircraft, fighter aircraft to Ukraine. On these issues, the United States will be in opposition to the plans. And so these will not materialize. But what will be announced in the meetings within the framework of NATO definitely is a further increase of true presence of NATO countries in Eastern Europe. And in sum, what the visit means is that what Biden said at the beginning of his presidency, namely America is back at the head of the table, is now actually displayed, namely that the US has accepted the role of the key and a core security supporter for Europe, who is indispensable, as the Europeans cannot defend themselves for various reasons. So this commitment by the United States to Europe, to European security, will also be demonstrated, and that's also an essential part of the current visit by Biden in Europe.
Yes, thank you. That actually builds a nice bridge, and I try to not waffle but ask that question now in a coherent fashion. Recently, I followed several very qualitatively high discussions that are talking about the Chinese-Russia relation, and that there may indeed have been an agreement to now take on the world, basically, together, the illiberal dictatorships of this world together. And when you look at the UN, who voted or who declined to vote against the Russians. That's quite interesting. It's over 40 countries. Now, I was looking into this and really wondering what philosophically, politically is really behind it. And I came across this politician, not political scientist of the, I think, 19th century, Ivan Ilyin. And there is this story between Ivan Ilyin and Putin, that Putin has for many, many years, forever maybe, been a real fan of Ilyin, even reinstated the anthem that under Stalin was texted by Ilyin, and has recovered the texts from the Chicago University of Ivan Ilyin. Speak a little bit about Ivan Ilyin and what it means for us today, because there seems to be this fascist core philosophy. And it seems to me that it's not just a put-on by Putin, but that this may be really at the core of what is going on, that it is making a stand, this old patriarchal, dictatorial world making a stand against this woke, liberal West world now. And that for me makes it so dangerous, as that is the reason why China and Russia ultimately would team up, if that makes any sense. But Ivan Ilyin seemed to me like a symbolically typical for the root cause of what's going on.
Well, it's certainly true that the writings of Ilyin have strongly influenced Vladimir Putin. He is one of his favorites when in his effort to interpret and understand Russian history. And he has very warmly received all the recommendations and positions of that person for the future of Russia. So I do think it influences Putin's view on the need to rebuild historic Russia, to make Russia a great power again with territorial expansion, to make Russia decoupled from the West culturally and not just politically and economically. So resorting to this idea that Russia is some sort of unique civilization, which is different from the Western civilization. And actually this war means that when the West breaks up relations with the Russian Federation, Russia will turn more and more into this, special civilization considered to have a historical mission, a civilization very much apart from Western values, norms, and institutions. So I think the war has catalyzed what had been in the wings already before the war, namely that Russia actually moves away from Europe, moves away from a European identity and tries to build an identity of its own. Well, there is ideological, of course, consensus between China and Russia on various issues, particularly on issues like the so-called unipolar world led by the United States with its aim to expand this zone of liberal hegemony. They want to bring down this unipolar status of the United States, and actually they themselves and some others have been rather successful in speeding up this process of the creation of a multipolar world. The Chinese and the Russians are fond of that idea of a multipolar world. They also agree on issues of state sovereignty, for instance. Western interpretation of state sovereignty, which is written down in Article 2, clause number 7 in the United Nations Charter, is that sovereignty of a state does not mean that the United Nations cannot actually interfere in the domestic affairs of such a state. Whereas the traditional interpretation by Russia and China, of course, and other countries is that sovereignty means sovereignty, meaning that the United Nations has no right to interfere into the domestic matters. On what China and Russia also agree is the fact that they are opposed to what is called humanitarian interventions on the basis of this concept, responsibility to protect. They clearly oppose it because they consider it as a Western instrument in legitimization of regime change in countries which are unfriendly to the West. That is something that the two are opposing as well. So on the diplomatic level, they have a lot of common interests, and they have pursued these interests over the past 15 years in a very strong fashion. China obviously is not very happy about this war, with China having good and qualified economic relations with both Russia and Ukraine. And of course, a war to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of an independent country is contrary to a central leitmotif of Chinese foreign policy, namely that such stuff must not happen. However, I don't see that the Chinese actually will be accepting Western demands that they need to try to influence Putin to stop the war, or that the Chinese would even go so far to leave Russia on its own and not help it to mitigate the impact of Western sanctions. Because as a Chinese friend told me a couple of days ago, well, the US now wants us to break with our strong ally, Russia. They want us to bring this entente between Russia and China to an end, or at least weaken it, so that they can in the future focus on China alone, so that they no longer have to deal with Russia, because Russia is economically devastated, financially devastated, and focus on China as the main competitor of the West, and particularly the United States in the future. So he said, why should we do so? Why should we help the West to deal with this problem on the European theater by spoiling our relationship with the Russians, who we need politically and diplomatically?
Thank you. May I take on one? You're still okay for time? You were speaking about this Russian isolation that has been growing and that now is exponentially growing. How are we supposed to behave? Because in the program that I'm running with 26 other countries along the European Union, it's an ecological project. The Russians were a part of it. They now have been excluded from the grant process from the European Union. It's a minor thing, but I didn't expect that it to go to universities, to go to Dostoevsky not being played anymore, and ridiculous stuff like that. Now, the lady who is running it, Katarzyna, I've decided to try and call her, and we will maintain a private relationship between a Russian and, in this case, an Austrian Czech. How are we as citizens, supposed to deal with this? Because I think it's incredibly dangerous to be swept away by anti-Russian sentiment, meaning anti-Russian population sentiment. And I'm literally really looking for ways to maintain communication at the very least. What would be, because you have people over there, what are you doing? What would be a positive step towards retaining at least a minimum of civil communication with the Russian people?
Well, like many European institutions, also my university, the University of Innsbruck, has issued the order that there must not be any institutional cooperation with Russian institutions, particularly not with regard to know-how transfer to Russia. Well, that's the decision taken. I myself am not very happy about it, because what must not happen, according to my view, is that we equate the decision by Russia's leadership to wage this war with Russia as a whole, with Russia's population. So we must do everything we can to stop Russophobia to spread. Ridiculous actions taking, like not playing compositions of Tchaikovsky, for instance. This is absolutely absurd, and this is just one sign of this new anti-Russian sentiment. What I do is to keep up contacts with all the contacts I already had before the war. This includes Russian scientists who are opposed to this war. Well, most of my contacts are opposed to this war, but I also keep contact with those who are supporting this war, at least nominally supporting that war, because I wanted to maintain contacts and maintain the exchange of views. And if Russian scientists who are in difficulties or get into difficulties because of their publicly announced opposition to the war, I will try to help as much as I can. I think it's also unfortunate that the airspaces of the West have been closed to Russian planes. We must not actually contribute to a development when Russian citizens can no longer travel to Europe or to the West in general. That actually isolates themselves, that actually undercuts any Western influence on this part of the Russian population. And this is seen and will be seen for a very long time as a very offensive Western sanction on the individual Russian citizen, which will lead to the fact that they will, even in greater numbers, come out in solidarity with the Russian regime. So I would say Russia as a country is different from the current Russian government, and we should keep that in mind and keep as many contacts open, as many communication channels open as possible. Let's not actually support the desire of the current Russian leadership to isolate Russia from the West, to de-Westernize Russia. We actually, with some steps taken by the Western side, are co-working with the Russian leadership in making Russia something different, something non-Western.
Unfortunately, also our Minister for Education called for a complete ban of contacts between Russian and Austrian scientists, which is quite ridiculous, unfortunately.
We should do the opposite, and to our dear listeners, we are looking for guests, and we hope that we will be able to get into conversation with Russian individuals. And the fact that governments are not necessary, their people, is not only true for Russia. And let us not forget that. So thank you very much indeed for sharing your insights. Thank you, Chris. And I beg you farewell and look forward to see you again.
Yes, hopefully soon.
Then. Ciao.
Thank you for having me.
Idealism prevails.
Make the world a better place.